Welcome back, listeners, to the Fraud Technology Podcast. And today we have somebody who has so much experience in the fraud space that I'm super, super excited in talking to her. The guest today is Sally Felton. And as I mentioned, she has about 40 years experience in the fraud industry. It's a great pleasure to have her on the podcast, and that too on the International Women's Day. Welcome to the podcast, Sally, and also a happy Women's Day today.
Thanks. It's good to be here, especially on International Women's Day. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you? So does this day mean special to you? How do you? Have you ever celebrated this? How do you even celebrate this?
Well, we have there's lots of good life affirming messages that come through from my team and from my contacts, and I guess I'm fortunate enough to work for a firm who are pretty good as far as a lot of the work that the International Women's Day is striving for. But the importance is about where industries and countries are not so good, where there's work to be done. And I was talking to somebody earlier and said, actually, it'll be good when we don't have to have International Women's Day because we don't need to worry about that sort of thing anymore. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that day too, but I think that'll be a little while off.
Yeah, I totally agree, right? It's been, and at least in my lifetime, I am not that old either, but still, in the 40 years that I've been, I've seen a tremendous growth in the opportunities. And I think we need to celebrate that. I'm sure there's still a long way to go itself. But yeah, so still happy. I'm not sure about, about this, but in Vietnam, today is celebrated very differently. And they do have, it's like for example, in Asia at least, International Women's Day, Valentine's Day, all these ones are not that culturally popular. They're not in the culture of the country itself. Vietnam, in that sense, is very different in that. They have specific Happy Women's Day messages, like in Valentine's Day you have cards and stuff like that, right? So there is specific wishes that you do in Vietnam. One of my best friends is a Vietnamese, so I always send her, and that's how I also remember this day. Yeah. Awesome. So one thing that I want to mention again is about your experience in the fraud space, and which is something that stuck out to me, is like you have like 40 years of experience in the fraud space.
Yeah, coming up to it. About 38 now. I'm so old.
Yes. So I want to pause for the audience for a second. 40 years. See, personally, right, whatever I know about AML or fraud industries is probably maximum 20 years. I know AML is probably after the US Patriot Act is when it became super popular globally. But you've been doing this 15 or 20 years prior to that. So I wanted to understand.
Oh, yeah.
What was the industry even like? I've never met anybody who had that kind of experience.
God, I was thinking about this earlier when I was preparing for the call for the podcast, and thinking, how much has changed. And actually, I would say the biggest evolution has absolutely been in the digital space. So I think back to, I started at Midland Bank, which became HSBC, obviously a massive global bank, and did 25 years there. And I started there in the 1980s. And we were heavily reliant on customers telling us that they had fraud. Then we had no ability really to monitor transactions or anything like that. And not only were we relying on customers telling us about fraud, it was usually by letter.
Oh wow!
Or they'd go into the bank to say, "Oh, I've just had my statement," which obviously came in a paper form.
Yeah.
So sometimes the fraud that had happened would be 4 weeks prior or longer. And we were heavily reliant on customers saying this is fraud. And I worked in a credit card environment because I've worked so long. I worked since before debit cards were a thing.
Yeah.
So in those days you had a cash point card to get your money out, a cheque, and your cash point card was also a cheque guarantee card, and then maybe a credit card. So the only way you could interact was taking cash out and buying things with cash, or writing a cheque. And then obviously that then evolved into debit cards, which people had to get their head around, a debit card that was the same as a cash point card, which was also a cheque guarantee card that they could pay for in shops. But again, even at that point, we weren't really very good at proactively monitoring for fraud. And then in the 90s, when I say we, I mean the banks, we introduced real-time fraud detection systems. Some of them were 10-minute delay, some of them were a day delay, some of them were real time. And that gave us the ability to say to customers while they were going through the transaction, we think this is strange activity based on what we think normal should look like for our customer base. And I'm not sure in those days whether we were even individual enough to be able to say this is what Sally usually shops like. We kind of were like, this is what our customers, we expect people to behave like this. And in those days you would get 3 responses when you went and paid for something with your card. So you'd swipe your card, you'd sign it, and you'd swipe the card, and then the merchant would say, yes, it's been approved, here's your receipt. No, it's been declined for one of many reasons. Or there'd be a referral, and in a referral, the cashier at wherever you were, let's say you're in Marks and Spencer's buying some shoes, the cashier would go, I've got to ring Sally's bank, and Sally might need to speak to her bank to give us authority to
Oh,
because it
wow.
looked suspicious. It was very, very manual. It was heavily reliant on human interaction. And I guess for me, the morph from the 80s through to the 2020s is all about the speed with which we can make decisions,
Yep.
the layers of fraud prevention and fraud detection that we have within the banking system. And until 2012, that was my experience. So I was HSBC retail banking. So that's what I'm kind of drawing on when I talk about fraud and how it's morphed. So for me, the biggest change has been the move to a technically automated, solution-driven fraud detection and prevention model, as opposed to waiting when your statement came each month in the post and checking it and making sure there was nothing that was you didn't recognize, because that's how it was. It was paper based, and we used to have telephone teams where people could go, I've had my statement, could you have a look at something on there I don't recognise. But we also had huge, we used to call them corrie teams, correspondence teams, who basically just worked the letters. And my mum worked in the post room at HSBC, opening letters and putting the letters into the various department slots
Oh, wow.
to to be delivered by hand to humans who read the letters and responded to them.
Oh, wow. And it was
Yeah.
called curry teams? Curry, like as in Indian
Corrie.
curry?
No, not curry, Corrie, that's my
Okay.
accent. Corrie. And that might have just
No,
been
no,
an
no.
HSBC thing,
Okay. No,
but it's short for correspondence because we
yeah,
were
yeah.
lazy and we couldn't be bothered to say correspondence. So we say the Corrie team.
Yeah.
And the Corrie team was paper based, and then you had the phone team who dealt with phones. And then obviously years later you had telephone banking and internet banking and all of the other things that come with it. And imagine now not knowing what's on your bank account unless you go into the bank and ask for them to print you a statement,
Yeah.
or literally waiting for your statement to arrive each month.
Yeah. Cannot
Whereas now
imagine.
we can all
Yeah.
see exactly what's going on hourly on our bank account if we want.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing that I wanted to clarify is when you're talking about these transactions at that time, the transaction itself in the happy path, in the first one is approved case, is real
Yep.
time, right? The transaction itself was
Yep.
real time, but
Yep.
the detection was not real time, right?
So in some fraud detection systems, even up to 2014, I was working with some banks who had a 10-minute delay. So that first transaction is gone.
Ah,
And
okay.
then because it's about cost, so a real-time fraud detection system for a bank is expensive, whereas having a 10-minute delay is a little bit cheaper for some players. I think in the 10 years since I worked with a company who had a 10-minute delay, I think most people would report now that they have real-time fraud detection because the speed of traffic is so
Hi,
much
yeah.
more. So it's so fast now. And the other thing to remember, in the 80s and 90s, it was very unusual to have cross-border transactions, because international payments were quite unusual. You
Yeah.
used to ring the bank and say, "Oh, I'm going to Spain for 2 weeks. Can you put a flag on my account so that I can use my credit card while I'm in Spain?" And more often than not, that flag caused more problems than if you hadn't rang them in the first place.
Yeah.
Because it was all a bit clunky in those days. It was all a bit old-fashioned.
Yeah, I understand. So one thing that I'm trying to think here now is, so one, the transaction was real time. The detection was probably not real time at the time, but now obviously the transactions have remained real time.
Yep.
Detection has become real time.
Yeah.
or prevention has also become real time. But how come the fraud has grown up? So I would assume that when you have transaction real time and fraud detection delayed, you have more opportunity, time sense wise, to do fraud. But as we see more statistics about fraud, the fraud is higher now. So I wanted to
Yeah.
understand where exactly is what are we missing here?
That's a really good question. And if I knew the answer to it, I'd be very rich because I would have invented something that would stop it. That's
Yeah.
that's the that's the answer, right? Fraud risk
Mm,
professionals like me
mm,
are constantly asked,
mm,
what's the next big thing? What's
mm,
coming? What should we be stopping? What should we be looking out for? And the very simple answer is we don't know. And
mm,
the reason we don't know is because we're not criminals.
mm,
And when I work with my clients, I'll
mm.
say to them all the time, I'm a good person trying to think like a criminal.
Yeah.
I'm trying very hard to put myself in a criminal's shoes.
Mm,
But the criminals
mm.
they've got bills to pay, right? So this is their job to them.
Yeah.
But they don't have
Mm,
budgets.
mm,
They don't sit in silos of their own industry. They
mm,
don't have governance processes to sign off if they want to try a new scam. They don't have
mm,
to go to the board and go, "Oh, I've just thought of a new way to scam people. Is it okay?" They just get on with it. And the
mm,
banks are constantly reacting to that.
mm,
Um, I think the opening up of the borders with the internet,
mm,
the digitalization of banking,
mm,
the way in which money moves now and the speed with which it moves, faster
mm,
payments. You know, if
mm,
we click to say, I want to pay my plasterer
mm.
for the money for the plastering he's just done next door, I want that money to go straight away.
Yeah. Mm,
Whereas 20, well, more than 20 years ago, 30 or 40 years ago,
mm,
he would have a cheque and that
mm,
cheque would take 4 or 5 days to clear,
mm,
or I'd take the cash out and he'd have cash. And
mm.
it's a much faster pace that we
Yeah.
live in now. And I'm
Mm,
not saying the glory years of the 80s and 90s were right. There were other things going on, there were,
mm,
you know, I'm not saying that it was
mm,
better then at all,
mm,
but it's different. And the speed with which we can transact now and
mm,
the customer expectation for payments
mm,
to be immediate
mm,
means that there are more
mm.
opportunities for criminals to abuse the system.
Understand, understand. So I also noticed in your experience itself that the first part of your almost 20, 30 years of fraud detection was in the bank itself, which you talked
Yep,
about Midland Bank and HSBC. And then
yep,
I believe you briefly spent some time at Metro Bank. And then
yep,
after that, you've been predominantly in the consulting space. I'm assuming
correct.
consulting
Yep,
clients, right? How has
yep.
the last 10 years been for you?
It's been really interesting because I haven't just worked with banks. So
Hmm.
since I've been a consultant, I've worked with loads of different firms. And when you're in the
Hmm.
banks, I work with, I still in touch with lots of people that I used to work with 20 or 30 years ago, and
Hmm.
lots of them are still in the banks. And when I talk to them about the types of work I do in the non-banking space, they're like, "Oh,
Hmm.
that sounds interesting." I work with
Hmm.
industrial manufacturers, I work with farmers, I work with
Hmm.
pharmaceutical companies, I might
Oh,
work
wow.
with
Hmm. Hmm.
local councils, that kind of thing. And
Hmm.
fraud happens in all of those industries.
Hmm.
So for me, having left the retail banking space when I did in 2012,
Hmm.
and obviously had the brief stint at Metro, which was
Hmm.
fine, and
Hmm.
then the consulting world since then. The last decade of my career has broadened my CV. I don't
Hmm.
think I'm not necessarily sure I've become any more of a subject matter expert on fraud vertically, but
Hmm.
actually what I have done is broadened my industry experience and been able
Hmm.
to go, okay,
Hmm.
so credit card fraud as
Hmm.
an HSBC would see isn't
Hmm.
a problem for a bathroom manufacturer
Yeah.
because a bathroom manufacturer might see some
Hmm.
kinds of other fraud. So
Hmm.
consequently, I have an appreciation
Hmm.
of what fraud might look like for individual clients as opposed to just having
Hmm.
this kind of really deep subject matter expertise in one
Domain
type
item.
of fraud.
Understand, understand. So, would love to understand. I mean, I've never personally explored fraud. I probably would have experienced it, but never thought at that time that. So, what are some interesting fraud modalities in, let's say, farming or pharma or industrial automation that you talked about? Any interesting types of fraud that happen there?
Well, it's funny because some of my clients who are not in the banking space, and it's very easy when you're in the banking space to think everybody
Hmm.
is
Have.
digital, technically minded,
Yeah.
and you come away from that. And I worked with a client 15 months ago and I said to them, what type of fraud are you concerned about? Let me take a step back. Sorry, let me take a step back. My clients come to me and say to me, can you come talk to me about fraud? And that's a really broad sheet, right?
Yeah.
So I'll say to them, okay, tell me what type of fraud you're thinking. Have you suffered a fraud? Has one of your peer groups suffered a fraud? So this particular client had come to me and said, actually, I just want to do some really general fraud training to our finance team on invoice financing fraud, email compromise fraud, that kind of thing. And we were chatting about their clients, and I won't be too specific about the industry that they're in, but I said to them, what type of fraud are you most concerned about? And they said, actually, most of our clients still pay us by cheque, right?
Okay.
So it's 2023, I think it was last year, that I spoke to them, and their biggest concern was cheque fraud. So that is still a valid way to pay money in the UK. Lots of businesses will still choose to use it, or some certainly do. And for this particular client, their biggest worry was cheque fraud. So there you're kind of like, okay, right. So this is an old-fashioned type of fraud. They also had an issue, another client of mine who are in a manufacturing environment. They're a business-to-business company, and they're worried about uh, identity fraud for the people that they trade with. So let's call them a closet manufacturer. So they manufacture closets. They sell to carpenters, and then the carpenters come to you and me and fit the
Yeah.
wardrobes, right? So my client who make the wardrobes and closets are worried that the carpenters are using stolen identity to get credit with them. And
Ah.
that's where their fraud problem is. So kind of saying to Sally from 25 years ago, oh, you're going to be working in these sorts of environments, I'd have been, oh God, I don't know enough about it. But you learn, and you put your criminal hat on, and you kind of say to these people, right, what would you do? How would you solve the problem? How can we find some controls that will ensure that the carpenters that you onboard as clients and give credit to, because you're giving them wardrobes on, you know, and expecting them to pay you 30 days later, how do you ensure that they are who they say they are when you onboard them? So it's not really very different to you or I applying for a loan, but in that space they've got to kind of think to themselves, right, okay, we need to be sure that we are bringing carpenters in this environment that are who they say they are, and that they're good to pay us in the 30 days when we invoice them, or for
Okay.
example.
Understand.
So yeah, it's
Understand.
been really interesting. And then, you've got lots of other types of fraud in different industries, in housing benefit, the NHS type frauds, internal, external, supply chain fraud. So I've worked with clients across all of them, and have had some very interesting conversations with senior stakeholders at the clients who I work with.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, that sounds fascinatingly diverse set of
Yeah, it's very
problem
diverse.
statements, right? Pretty
Yeah.
exciting as well, I guess, to be solving so diverse set of
Oh, I
problems.
don't know. I'm not sure I solve very much. I think I talk a lot, but I'm not sure I solve very much. I usually just move on, and I never know whether it's worked.
I'm sure, I'm sure your clients come back to you with
Yes,
feedback and how things are
I have
working.
a
Yeah,
lot of, yeah, I have some repeat business, which is good. That's always good.
that's a good sign. Yeah. So I wanted to understand. Obviously, almost 20 years or so in specific industry. Now working with different clients. How do you go about adopting some of the strategies that you probably did in the banking space? How do you adopt this to solve these problems? So let's say when you hear a problem, an interesting problem, how do you go about solving these problems for different clients?
Good question. I very often, as I say, I'm given a very general remit sometimes with some of my clients, and we kind of have to whittle it down as to what they really want me to talk to them about. And that's about having conversations early in the project to say, okay, are you worried about internal fraud? I mean, do you think your staff are stealing from you? Or do you think that actually your customers are the way that you're losing money? Because when we talk about fraud in a business, for example, let's not talk about the banks, but we're talking about non-banking. So if we're talking with a sizable company in the UK, for example, the way in which you need to think about fraud risk management with those guys is, how does money leave your business? So if money leaves your business through you paying your staff, you paying your suppliers, you giving your suppliers credit potentially, your customers potentially abusing the refund system that you have, all of these ways in which money might leave your business. So I will have conversations, and the most important thing I can do with my clients is understand their business model. Rather than trying to go in and solve the fraud problem for them without having a conversation, I need to understand what what the money flow looks like, and all the time thinking, how would I take it out of the system? How would I remove it from the system? And very often when I deal with clients, I deal at quite a senior level. I might deal with internal audit teams. I might be invited in by boards to come and do some board training. But actually, what I also want to do is have conversations with people on the ground floor. So if I'm doing a framework review for a client, for example, to understand what approach, what prevention and detection they've got within their business, not only do I want to talk to the stakeholders who set the policies, I actually want to talk to the operational staff who execute the policies and procedures, because what they think is going on up here, quite often I speak to the operations staff and they go, oh yeah, we don't do that. That's a pain. We do this, and this could be causing a problem. And I worked with a client years ago, and I try to educate the clients about understanding where the fraud might be a problem for them if they don't know themselves. So just to tell you a quick story, if that's okay.
Yep.
I was
Yep.
working with a client a number of years ago who wanted us to talk to them about fraud in the boardroom. So we did a training session. We went to this, it was like this James Bond themed
Wow.
lair, almost, these huge chairs and screens everywhere. It was really flash. And they said to me, talk to us about fraud in the boardroom. So CEO fraud, that kind of high level, low volume, high value fraud that might devastate a company. So one multi-million pound transaction that causes them a problem. So we did that session, and I said to them, have you thought about how fraud might affect you in other areas in your business? And they were like, yeah, we're not really worried about the low level fraud. So I said to them, okay, let me ask you a few questions, and then I want to work through a model with you. And at the time, as I say, they're a manufacturer, and they had about 16,000 staff in factories around the UK making their product.
Yep.
And the factories were set up with old-fashioned cards where you punched in and punched out each day. So you and I would have a card next to each other in the machine, punch in and punch out. And that's how you were paid, because you're paid hourly. So I'd go in at 8 o'clock in the morning, Sally's arrived, we start paying her, and at 5:30, Sally's gone home, we pay her for her time. And I said to the head of finance who was there, the finance director, I said to him, okay, so let's say of those 16,000 staff, 4,000, so a quarter of them, claim 1 hour a week they're not entitled to in overtime or extra pay, by me saying, Ravi, can you clock me in on Monday morning? I'm going to be a bit late, but clock me in. And then you saying to me, Sal, I'm nipping home early tonight, can you clock me out? So let's say 4,000 of them did 1 hour a week, overtime, extra time, however they're paid, at minimum wage. Okay? So I said to them, right, calculated that, and I said to them, if a quarter of your staff are doing that, that's £1.5 million a year at
Wow.
minimum wage. So that's at the time it was like £7.50, I think, a week, about £30 a month. And the gentleman I was talking to said, I don't think anyone would bother.
Oh,
So I
wow.
said to him, why do you not think anyone would bother? And he said, I just don't think anyone would bother for £30 a month. So I said to him, okay, so when you're on minimum wage, £30 a month is fish and chip money on a Friday, or it's a treat for the kids to go to the pictures, or it's just a bit of pocket money
Yep.
for the family. And he couldn't get his head around, because he was so far removed financially,
From the
and
people.
he had lost touch with what was going on in his firm. And in the end, the solution is very easy. It's a biometrics face scanner or a thumbprint, so that I can't log you in early on a Monday and you can't log me out late on a Friday, because it's about facial recognition or whatever. And those units were, like, at the time, about £400. So I said to him, the result will be a number of things. You'll either have workforce who are giving you an extra hour a week because they're
Yep.
used to the money and they want it. You'll have people who, your wage bill will come down because people won't want to do it because they're lazy, okay? Or
Yep.
you'll have people leave because they don't want Big Brother looking after them with their fingerprint.
Yep.
It's hard to see how the firm would be at a loss. But he couldn't get his head around it.
Yeah, I
So
can.
when I work with a lot of clients, we might be talking about one thing, but actually, once I get to know the business and understand the business model, I can start to think about how fraud might be occurring, and it might not have been occurring.
Yeah.
But that comes up, that then in turn talks about the culture of a firm, because if you're treated really well, it's really hard to square off stealing from somebody. Whereas if you're treated really badly, rationalizing that fraud, or that fraud triangle, rationalizing that when you're treated badly as an employee or as a customer or anyone else, it's easier to square it off when you're not being treated well.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. This reminds me also the case that you talked about is that if you let it go, let's say one person starts doing it, if you let it go, over time more people pick it, and even if there were people who never wanted to do it, they were principled in their approach how they want to do, you are essentially penalizing good people,
Yeah,
financially penalizing good people,
totally.
which replicates into culture that
Yeah,
I am a good person but I'm not appreciated is a, I mean, again, the ramifications of that can be in many, many ways. That it can be quality, it can be just that I don't care about the company. Somebody pays me $2 more, I'm going to move on, right? So it ramifies into many, many different things. So there was this theory about how cheating in any form, if it is left unchecked, how it impacts the culture of the overall company itself. And again, there were studies about this in universities. So this sounds like a proxy where I don't come to class on time, but I ask somebody else to give attendance on my behalf, essentially, right? So that sounds
yeah.
fascinating. And also one thing that you did talk about, which I was very curious about, is boardroom fraud. I'm curious about what type of boardroom fraud does happen. I can understand insider trading, like before a decision is made, you tell somebody else so that you buy stock on the company's behalf and you make money out of it, right? So that I can understand. But are there other types of boardroom fraud that happen?
Yeah, I mean, when we say about fraud in the boardroom, we mean about, particularly the training that I've been doing is making the board aware of what fraud might look like in their business,
Okay.
as opposed to boardroom in particular. I mean,
Mm.
there are cases where fraud has occurred as a result of boardrooms behaving badly. Um, but essentially, it's driven by culture. And I was asked to comment on a case a few months ago where a CEO was so belligerent that nobody wanted to challenge him. And so it was a small company, and he was approached by the funder of the company. I can't go into too much detail, but essentially it was a company that was funded. They had a funding company, and the funding bloke, let's say, approached the CEO and said, "Oh, I need you to release £400,000 on Friday evening at about 4 o'clock in order for me to fund another project, but I'm going to pay it back on Monday. Don't worry." So the CEO didn't do any checks, then said to his finance director and the finance team, "You need to release this money." The money was released.
Oh wow.
On Monday, the funder said to the CEO directly, "Oh, that wasn't quite enough. We need £700,000 and I'm going to pay it all back tomorrow." So the £700,000 was released, and then nothing else happened. They never heard from the funder again. The money didn't get paid back. So roll forward a few months, we were asked about the case, and we looked at the investigation that had happened, and there were lots and lots of conversations happening with the finance team saying, "Are we really sure this is okay? Are we really sure this is okay? This sounds a bit dodgy to us." But the culture was so bad that no one was brave enough to say to the
Oh wow.
CEO, "This is a problem." And when further checks were done, the CEO had done no social media training, no social engineering training, no data protection training, had just taken the word from this random email that sort of looked like it had come from his funder, to the tune of over £1 million, which people knew underneath him was dodgy but were too scared. So fraud in the boardroom training, so we talk about, I train boards to be aware of fraud.
Okay.
So that is, so I was asked a few years ago if you could have one question on a health check tool that we were designing. You can have one fraud question. What's it going to be? And I'm like, oh God, that's so hard. I said, I would like the question to be, is fraud a standing agenda item on your boardroom meetings every quarter, every half year, however often you meet as a board or an exco, whatever the top of the shop meeting is in your business, is fraud a standing agenda item on that meeting? Because if it is, great. What do you talk about? What frauds do you discuss? How do you deal with it? How do you articulate around the room? How do you filter those down to your business? And if the answer is no, that's a whole different conversation. Fraud is the most reported crime in the UK. 40% of 40% of crimes
Crime is
in the
related to fraud.
UK are fraud, right? So it is a massive problem. And any business of any size really, certainly of a sizable business, is going to be subject to fraud of some kind at some point in its lifetime. So why wouldn't you want to talk about it? Even if you go, have we had any frauds this week or this month or this quarter? Yes, we've had two. This is the control we've put in place. We think we've got it under control. We're doing a review. Fine, move on. The
Yeah.
next month you might go, oh no, we haven't had any that we know about, obviously that you know about. We haven't had any this month. Okay, good. Because what that can then do is give you some comfort that month on month or year on year, you're managing any fraud that might come to the surface in your business. You're not going to necessarily know about all of it, but at least if you can articulate it's on your agenda and you know how you deal with it
Yeah.
when you do have that, if that happens, then that's half the battle.
Okay.
What you
Wonderful.
don't want as a business is sorry to interrupt you, but what you don't want as a business is to not do anything, suffer a fraud, because that's going to be far more expensive for you than just putting some fraud controls in the first place.
Okay. Understand. So when you talk about fraud controls, right, and again, you're talking about multiple industries, multiple types of
Yeah.
businesses as well. So how do you approach this? What kind of technology do you even suggest? Because it may be so varied in their different ecosystems that is there
Yeah.
a standard technology that people do that you do recommend, or how does that work?
So no, it completely depends on the industry. So obviously in the banks, when you're looking at fraud detection and fraud prevention, there's not one tool that does everything. You've
Correct.
got one tool that might monitor what my spending looks like. We've got another tool that looks at my location base. I've got another tool that looks at how I interact with my device. And they all provide a score when you check out or click or tap or whatever, right? So multiple layers. That's not one. There's not one of anything.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because technology moves really quickly. A few years ago, I worked with a company who had come up with a really smart idea that when a card's used and it's suspicious, they'll ping their mobile phone of the customer as well. So that if the card and the mobile phone seem to be in the same location, you're good to go.
Yeah.
But if the card's in one country and the phone's in another, it's a
Yeah.
bit
Suspicious.
suspicious.
Yeah.
But we use digital wallets now.
Yeah.
So that's going
Yeah.
to be used. So that technology very quickly became obsolete. Not obsolete, I don't mean that, because there are still people that use cards, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's less attractive than it was 10 years ago because we now use digital wallets, or
Yeah.
lots of us do. So in the banking world, they have lots of different things, and the reason for that is some of them become obsolete very quickly, and you move on to the next solution, or you plug the next solution on the top, and you plug another one on the top.
Okay.
In the non-banking world, it's a lot harder because lots of firms aren't very digitally minded for potentially. There are different types of fraud, but what you can be doing for internal fraud is monitoring email traffic, monitoring your expenses policies, that kind of thing. And then when we talked about factory workers or people who have where there's a possibility of timesheet fraud, having those slightly more security conscious ways into the building, ways into logging in if you're paid hourly, that kind of thing. So there are lots of different solutions for the problem. Some of them do still rely on people. And when you look at a lot of fraud figures and the way in which a lot of fraud outside the banks, the way in which a lot of fraud is notified to businesses, a lot of it comes through humans, whistleblowing. So they'll go, do you know what? That looks dodgy. What that bloke in the corner of the office does,
Yeah.
and somebody might blow the whistle, and an investigator will come in. So there is still for all the tech that we've got in place in 2024, going back to the 80s when I started at the bank. Actually, the humans sometimes can just sniff it out because it just sounds
Doesn't
wrong.
add up. Yeah.
Something's yeah, exactly that. Something doesn't add up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a computer will only give you so much until a human goes, I'm just going to scratch the surface a little bit because something doesn't feel right.
Yeah, yeah, got it, got it. So you also talked about working with banks as well. I'm assuming you still consult with banks as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So can I understand what are the typical types of problems that banks come to you with? Because I would assume that they have most of the technology in place. I mean,
Yep.
most
They
people have
do.
the technology, right? So I wanted to understand what type of problems do they come to you, for external consulting teams, for example.
So they come to us for lots of reasons. They come to us quite often because there's a problem and they need somebody outside the bank to help them. I get asked a lot into to work with the banks because of like broad breadth of experience I've got because I can take what's happening in one particular organization and kind of
Cross
apply it elsewhere. And
cross
that isn't
learning, yeah.
about yeah, and obviously there's a client confidentiality piece there. I can't go into I don't know XYZ Bank and go, oh, ABC Bank do this. But what we can do is say, actually, what's working in the industry is this, and we can advise on that. I work with lots of smaller banks who are starting up, who are coming new to the market, who maybe don't even have a fraud policy in
Yeah.
some cases. They know that they need something. So it can be everything from training, it can be anything including writing policies, reviewing procedures, having a third party to come in and just say, just have a look. Tell us if we are industry standard or not. Now, that's not to say that the heads of fraud in the banks don't speak to each other. Of course they do. But actually, I get a lot of conversation or a lot of requests to talk about fraud because I talk to lots of other industries and lots of industries within that FS bracket.
Yeah.
The banks, the payment services, the insurers, all of them have different challenges in that fraud space, but they're all interlinked. So very often I'm asked to provide some training to boards who just want to be a bit more aware of what's going on out there. That because it's very easy. I spoke to somebody this week, funnily enough, who said, if I get an external email, an email from someone outside of my bank, it's a bit weird because everything is done within
The bank.
the banking world, within your own world within the bank. So when I worked at HSBC, it was unusual to get emails from somewhere outside, but actually now I get all sorts, and
Yeah.
that's the beauty of it. So that's what I can bring, some richness to that independent thought.
Okay, got it, got it. So basically, you're leveraging your experience talking to so many clients and kind of building your own best practices essentially in different
Yeah.
parts of the business itself, and then so that you can share that knowledge to different teams itself. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and that's always overlaid with the regulator, the FCA in the UK or whatever jurisdiction I might be working in, and then any legal and legislative changes that are coming.
Okay.
So in the UK, for example, we have the failure to prevent offence under the new Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act that basically says if you fail to prevent fraud as a business of a certain size within the UK, we're going to actually, we might prosecute you. There will be criminal ramifications for doing so.
Oh wow.
So lots of companies are now thinking, okay, what does that mean? How do I interpret that? What do reasonable procedures look like? And that's where they engage with third-party consultants like myself and everyone else that is out there doing great jobs, because we can add some flavour and richness to that and help them design some frameworks that will be robust enough to stand the test of time.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you just touched on the UK regulator FCA, right? So they came up with the new APP fraud reimbursement policy, and that's
Yep.
going to be coming live in October, right? So how do you feel about this new policy?
So the contingent reimbursement model went live a few years ago, which basically said the banks that had signed up to it said, we will give you your money back in the cases where we think you are a victim of fraud. Um, the new regulations go slightly beyond that. So everyone's going to be required to do so by October this year. And
Yep.
the regs say that the paying bank and the beneficiary bank, in simple terms, you'll be jointly liable for any APP fraud.
Yep.
So that is a big shift for a lot of companies in the UK. I think it's a good thing. I do think it's a good thing. Um, because let's say I'm a scammer and I've sent out 20,000 emails, which is easy for a scammer to do. They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
20,000 emails saying, I don't know, I'm the Pope. Pay me £5,000. I've had an email from the Pope, so I'm using this as an example. I'm the Pope. You're my special envoy. Send me £200, and I will enlighten you, or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
Some people, as crazy as it sounds, some people will do that, and the money comes in.
Mm.
My bank is not doing anything there.
Yeah.
They're just the money's coming in, so the paying banks are going, Ravi, are you sure that this is the Pope? Are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? And you've seen those messages a million times. Click, click, click. Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure. I just want to pay the Pope.
Yeah.
Comes to me. Now, in the new regs,
Mm.
the rules state that there is an onus on the beneficiary bank to
Receiving back.
do some checks and also pay the money back in the case where I'm still in the UK. This is all about the UK as well. Let's not forget that. I'm not in the Vatican. I'm in the UK. Um, so I've got all the money. So there is some responsibility on the on the beneficiary bank, sorry, to do some checks and say to the paying bank, I've got an awful lot of money coming into Sally from other people. Are you sure you want Ravi's money to go in? And there is that. That is a good thing. I think there is a good thing. I still maintain that there is a long way to go in scams.
Yeah.
There's a lot of data sharing that could happen. The social media companies must see a lot of this traffic as well. We
Yeah.
need to have conversations with them. I'm not a technical expert, right? This is a very simplistic brain. Remember, I came from the 80s where it was just humans.
Yeah.
So I'm learning this stuff. But in my head, I'm like, okay, the Pope, obviously, this is a crazy example, but there are people, out there on social media. We've all seen the catfish
Scam.
scams. We've all seen Tinder swindler, all of those things. These are real life scams, and there's a certain amount of social media, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, all of that stuff, where there is data there as well that, in my view, we could be leveraging. And I don't know how we do that. And getting through GDPR is obviously an issue. But in short, yes, I think there are going to be some challenges with the new APP rules. There are going to be some interesting case studies. And actually, some of the banks in the UK, and the UK is pretty forward thinking. I know Citibank, I think it was Citi. If I'm wrong, Citibank. But I think Citibank in the US had a fine recently for failing to prevent enough APP fraud, or that they didn't protect their customers. There was something, I
Yeah.
think. But again,
Yeah.
maybe.
I think it's linked
I think,
to Citibank, Zelle, and few other. All of
right.
them were prosecuted together. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. We're going some way to do that. And the UK is leading the way in a lot of this technology and a lot of the thinking. But some of the banks in the UK have started to reintroduce humans into the
Is the process
So to
itself.
give you an example, years and years ago, when I was at HSBC. There was a gentleman, let's call him Mr. Smith, and I was notified by the bank, one of the branches, many, many times over a couple of years, saying, Mr. Smith's back in the bank. He wants to send more money to the golf course in Spain that he's investing in. And we kept saying to him, Mr. Smith, are you really sure you want to send £2,000 to this golf course in Spain? Have you been? Have you seen it? And when the amount of money he'd sent got to £200,000,
Oh,
he
wow.
rang us and said, oh, do you know what? I think it is fraud. Can you get me my money back? And
Oh,
we kind
wow.
of went, well, no, it's gone for a start, but also we have told you many, many times. So I think that in reintroducing humans into this process is going to be interesting, because when a case gets to the ombudsman, whether Mr. Smith says to the ombudsman, HSBC won't give me my money back, or Barclays won't give me my money back and I've been scammed, if the banks can say, look, he's had 5 messages on his internet banking, we've phoned him, we've spoken to him many times, we've spent 3 hours explaining to him that this is fraud, and he still wants us to pay that money, what happens then? Is
Yeah.
the bank really going to be held liable when they genuinely have done everything they can? And I don't know what the answers are going to be in those cases. It will be an interesting couple of years to see, once the regs come in and the banks have to get on board. It will be interesting to see how that works.
Yep. I definitely think. I personally feel it's probably a little lopsided towards the banks. It's hard on the banks probably, because
Yeah.
now the onus of proving is on the bank,
Yeah.
and most of the people working in the bank it doesn't impact them personally, right? So somebody, let's say I'm fighting on the fraud prevention side, and you have a timeline that I have to prove within 5 working days. If not, the money is reimbursed, right? There's a timeline to
There
it.
is a caveat on that. They will have 35 working days. They can stop the clock at some point.
Ah, okay,
As
okay.
long, yeah, that five, yeah, there's going to be a slightly longer period if there is any concern about the, I think, that negligence issue.
Yep, yep.
That there is an ability to extend that 5 days.
Okay, okay, wonderful. So that's what I felt when I read the regulations itself, that while for a person who is getting scammed, it's a very personal journey. It's my
Yeah.
money. I would be very
Yep.
emotional. But for the people who are fighting it, it's not an emotional journey. It's a
Correct.
statement, policy document. There's also branding part to the bank itself, because if the bank says that I can't pay you or I won't pay you, because it's emotional to me as a victim, I could take to social media and keep talking about it. So there's a lot of things
Yeah.
that I, as a bank, would be worried about. I may just think, oh, let me just pay it back. Let me not worry, right?
Yeah, it's really tough, and I've spoken to people from different parts of the industry, and they are concerned about how this is going to go, because it's pretty clear that there is a requirement. I think it was kind of like high 90%, 98% of refunds are to be given to the customer,
Oh,
and
wow.
there are lots of customers who are genuinely victims.
Yep.
They genuinely are, but it kind of, my worry is actually if customers become more aware of this, are they going to be slightly less careful with their money because they think, oh, if it is a scam, I know I'll get my money back.
Yep.
And actually, that's, is there going to be, or am I thinking that people understand this stuff? And, I live in a fraud bubble, and actually the reality is that, most people have got far more interesting things to worry about than the new APP rules, right?
Yep.
So it does worry me for a number of reasons. I can see why they want to do it. They want to, they don't want genuine victims to be disadvantaged financially.
Yep.
But by doing so, are we actually making it problematic for the banks, and actually causing complacency on the part of the customer, and actually easier for first party fraudsters to go, yeah, that wasn't me.
Yep. Yep.
I don't know. So I think it's a work in progress, and we'll see in the next few years how that rolls out.
Yep, yep. So I think it's a great direction where we are going. I still think there is few fine tuning that's probably
Yeah.
required, right? So I
Yeah.
also wanted to talk about social media that you talked about, and how the responsibility of social media is also a little. I mean, they are also not very proactive in countering such fraud. And I wanted to share my anecdotal experience, and again, I wouldn't say this is the only way that happens. So I am pretty generally tech savvy. I'm also aware of fraud. I mean, I'm working on a startup in the fraud space, right? So I would think that I at least would know how frauds happen, right? If something is happening, I can detect it. But
Yep.
one day I received a text on my Instagram from a friend of mine. It was a girl, and I had a crush a long time ago with her. And we had never kept in touch, or we were infrequently chatting, basically, right? And then suddenly I get a text from her, and it was a new account, but with the same face and most of the images being the same. And then I was like, hey, why did you create a new account? Then she was like, oh, I have a lot of people who I don't want to be friends with. So implying indirectly, at least the way I understood it, is I was one of that person that she trusts, which is, again, because of my history, clicked well for me personally in my
Yep.
emotional journey, right? Now the chat went on. I did not doubt what the intention behind it was. Eventually, obviously, the mistake that the fraudster made was to ask to send Apple credit, basically. And I knew instantly Apple credit is a dead giveaway for fraud. And so that's when I realized that it was a scammer. And I knew the girls' kids' names. So I asked him or her, whoever was a fraudster, and I changed the kids' names, and I asked her, hey, how are they doing? And then they did not respond to the question. So I was like, wow, smart. But anyway, so as you see, it depends on what place we are at as people. It doesn't
Yep.
matter how
Yep.
well knowledgeable we are. And people do talk about education, but sometimes it's just that you just don't see it. It just doesn't
Yeah.
it doesn't click in your head itself. And I'm sure social media could have done something of this, because I'm sure Instagram knew that somebody was creating with the same name, with the same photo. It is so easily detectable, right? So anyway, so I was like, why didn't Instagram stop this, right? Anyway, my gripes aside, one last question to you is, Sally, you worked with a company called CFAS, or a community called CFAS, right?
CIFAS, yes.
CIFAS, okay. I was going to ask
Yeah.
you how to pronounce it. CIFAS. So what is
Yes.
CIFAS, and how does it work? Who is the community for? Is it for individuals, or is it for financial institutions, or is it for any companies? So I wanted to understand more about CIFAS itself.
Yeah, so CIFAS is a lovely firm. So they're the UK's fraud prevention service, and they have two databases. So one database is full of, so the members are generally the banks, but there are some housing associations, there's some local councils, some insurers. So you can be a member of CIFAS if you want. It's based on a reciprocal model. So you give information and you take information out, and essentially they have a database called the National Database, which is full of data about fraudsters and victims, so that known cases, and they have a standard of proof. So you can't load anything onto there. It has to meet a certain standard. And then they have an internal fraud database, which is if members end up dismissing members of staff for fraud, for again meeting a standard of proof, you can load that name into the CIFAS database, and obviously you have to tell everybody that's involved, including the member of staff, that they'll be loaded to the CIFAS database. And that essentially means that when you apply for jobs, if I'm at a bank, ABC Bank, and I'm a member of CIFAS, if I have you apply for the job, I can say to you, I'm going to run your name through the CIFAS
CIFAS
database
database.
to ensure that you're not a fraudster, that you have been fired from somewhere for fraud, and that's essentially what it is. So it's when I was at CIFAS, it became very apparent very quickly that they are a really unique firm globally, that I don't think there's anything else globally in any other territory that kind of has anything like it. And it's a very useful tool for that early kind of onboarding of accounts. So you can go, okay, we've seen if Sally loads a combination of a dodgy address, if I'm a new customer, dodgy address, dodgy phone number, and and CIFAS have seen it before, they might go back to that bank and say, do you want to think about this, because this has come up with an alert for frauds elsewhere.
Okay, got it. That sounds like a kind of a consortium kind of a concept, where
So it's about consortium data. Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, it's a reciprocal model. So I couldn't sit there just going, I'm just going to check everyone else's data and never put anything in. You have to reciprocate as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sally. I mean, that was really insightful, and almost we spent 50 minutes talking about this. And again, I just lost track of time as well. And a lot of insights around how, especially different industries, some of the boardroom stuff that you're talking about, and in general, 40 years of experience in the industry. Wow.
Yes,
Really,
yeah,
really
getting there.
So really appreciate for you to take time to speak to us. I'm sure a lot of
Pleasure.
our listeners would love listening to your insights as well, and would love to have you some other time to have a further conversation as well.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much,
It's
Sally.
been really interesting. Thanks, Ravi.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.